You're tuned to 1520 WCHE Radio, and it's time now for the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will offer reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today. And now, Sam Hankin.
Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Avid Reader. Hey, I just wanted to tell you that we are very proud that our bookshop, Wellington Square Bookshop, has just won 2 great awards. One is the best coffee shop on the main line. I don't know if I'd agree with that, but we won the prize. And the other is the best bookshop in Philadelphia, as voted by the Philly Hot List. And, you know, while it's difficult to thrive as an independent bookstore in this climate, you know, we've been able to do that, and it's nice to be recognized. And being an indie, it's a pleasure to have as our guest today Emily St. John Mandel, whose latest novel, Station 11, just published by Knopf, has hit the indie bestseller list, which is our bestseller list. We like to go by it. Has hit it running and is rising rapidly. Emily even has an up arrow next to her book now. Emily's earlier works include Last Night in Montreal, The Singer's Gun, and the Lola Quartet. She writes for the millions, which is great, and her work appears in many anthologies, including the best mystery stories of 2013. So Station 11 is a post-apocalyptic novel, and at first I'm going, oh no, do I really need another end of the world wiped out Ebola novel, which she may have heard before. But then I started reading it, and I realized it's not really that. The book is not really that at all. It's something else. So let me see if I can put it fairly intelligently. Usually the author can do it better than me, but I like to hear myself talk. It's a work about human beings, their relationships, their pasts, their memories of a long-gone world, long gone for some and not long gone for others, and hopes, dreams, and trepidation about the future. It doesn't do the usual litany of murderous bands, roaming the countryside, nuclear winters, searches for kindred souls or lost relatives. It stars a mass protagonist, which is a traveling group of survivors, both a symphony and an acting troupe performing Shakespeare, and trying to maintain for others a semblance of not only civilization, but of beauty, evocation, and something like nostalgia, but more so. And there's a fascinating backstory that really shapes the book and helps send us back and forth in time. And actually, there's a third and more mysterious backstory as well, but I'll stop there. So, Emily, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for interviewing me.
So one of the first things I always ask is, because at the bookstore, everyone, belies the cliche, which is that, don't judge a book by its cover, because everyone who comes to my bookstore does indeed judge a book by its cover, and it really makes a difference with regard to sale. And I know the publishing company, they have to have a good cover because they know that's a good gauge of what the sales are going to be. So with your cover, did you get a chance to vet it? Did you get a chance to work with it? Or how did that come about?
I did get a chance to vet it, which I was very grateful for. And it's interesting. When I first saw this cover, it was exactly what you see now, which I'll just describe it briefly for the benefit of any listeners who don't have the book in front of them. It's an image of 3 or 4 tents. They're kind of luminous under a starry sky on a landscape of grass. So they've been set up in a field somewhere. And the original cover was exactly the same, except instead of grass, it was a kind of almost a desert landscape. It was all sand and stone. And I thought it was beautiful in a bleak kind of a way. But the sales rep saw it, and they said, you know what, this looks like sci-fi, which obviously there's nothing wrong with sci-fi, but that's not exactly what the book is. So we went back and forth with a few ideas, and at one point a whole different cover was proposed, which I can't say I was crazy about. And then at one point, as we were thinking and talking about it, I had an idea, and a couple of other people had the same idea too, so I can't take full credit. But it seemed to me that what made the cover read as sci-fi was that desert landscape of rocks and sand. So I suggested, it's easy for me to suggest this when I don't have to spend 12 hours in Photoshop, but why don't we just Photoshop in something that would make it more identifiably Earth? So what the art department came up with was grass, and they Photoshopped in that grass that you see in the cover, which I think solved the sci-fi problem. And it was really wonderful that the publisher was open to that suggestion from me and from others. And I just think the cover is beautiful. The designer in this case is so good.
Yeah, it really is true. When people come into the store and your book's on the front table, like I was talking about with regard to being on the indie bestseller list, and that's what, when people come into our store, that's what the books are looking for. but you pass by it, and it's just right on the edge of the table, and you can see people. You can always tell when people reach their hands out and run their hand across the cover that they like the book.
Nice.
And it really does.
It's interesting texture too.
Yeah, I know. I know that makes a big difference in it. But it sounds funny because it sounds like it was originally almost like the cover of something like Dune or something like that. And
it could have been. Those tents really could have been another planet. It's kind of funny.
Right. They could have been those, the one like Stilgar did where, you rescue the water from the tent each night, to use to... Anyway, so I could go on forever. So anyway, before I have tons of questions, but tell us a little bit about the book and how you came up with the idea. I think before we started the show, we were talking a little bit about Shakespeare, and Shakespeare kind of shapes the book itself, and how that came about before, if it was indeed before, you decided it would also involve the idea of a post-apocalyptic world.
Sure, absolutely. I thought your introduction was great, by the way. I think you summarized the book very well.
Thanks.
The book takes place in a time very much like the present, and then also in a time 20 years after a devastating flu pandemic. And before I knew that I'd have that post-apocalyptic element, when I first started thinking about and writing this book a few years ago, I was originally thinking that it would be a book about an actor and a traveling Shakespearean theater company in the present day. I was imagining a very quiet literary book, whatever that means, just about the life of an actor. I was interested from the very beginning in what it means to devote your life to art, the joys and the cost of that. But at the same time, I wanted to write a love letter to this world we find ourselves in, this incredible place where you flip a switch in the wall and the room's flooded with electric light, or where we can conduct this interview by telephone, for example, or the way water comes out of tap. These are extraordinary things that I think we tend to take for granted, to the extent that we don't even really see them or think about them anymore. And it seemed to me that one way to write about these things was to contemplate their absence. So I thought it would be interesting to make the setting post-apocalyptic for that reason. To write about a world where all trappings of civilization were to fall away. But I really loved that idea of a traveling Shakespearean theater company that it had from the beginning. So it seemed to me it would be interesting to have that in this post-apocalyptic landscape. And of course, I'd had the Shakespeare as an idea before I knew it was post-apocalyptic. But as I began to think about what the symphony's repertoire would be as they travel through the settlements of this very different world, I began to read more about Shakespeare's life. And it's interesting. I hadn't known that much about it before, but it seemed to me that there was some really interesting parallels between the time and the place that he lived in and the time and the place of my post-pandemic, post-apocalyptic novel. The most obvious, of course, being that in his time, the theater would very often have been a matter of these small traveling companies of players going from place to place. And there was also something else which I hadn't previously known about, which was that the more I read about his life and the time and the place he lived in, the more clear it seemed to me that his life had been heavily marked by the episodes of bubonic plague that swept over Elizabethan England repeatedly through his lifetime. He was the third born to his parents, but the first to survive infancy. 3 of his siblings were probable plague victims. His only son, died of plague at 11 and left behind a twin. And you see it in his work. There are allusions to plague here and there. And it just seemed to me that the people that surrounded him and Shakespeare himself, that these people would have been perhaps somewhat haunted by their memories of pandemics in the recent past, which was, of course, exactly the effect I was writing about in my novel. So it began to seem more and more fitting to me that my traveling company would only perform Shakespeare. And it was interesting to have Shakespeare as a sort of through line through the book. It opens with a performance of King Lear in the present day, and then that's a play that they're still performing in the distant future, 20 years out after societal collapse.
Yeah, it's like I was thinking, that Shakespeare is kind of like a tapestry, and the line of King Lear really runs through the entire thing. And you have these characters that are kind of in the beginning, in the middle, in the end. They're tangential. Jeevan is kind of very, very important, but then maybe he's not so important to the book. But he's clearly drawn, and you really are drawn to him because he has a life that's. It's really interesting how you do it. You create a character that has a life, a part of a life that he regrets. He's moving on in his life, and then you wonder, well, wait a minute, how does this affect the book itself? But then there's an undercurrent that he creates, isn't there, that gives a more of a, I don't know, an emotional flavor to the book. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Right. I think I do, yeah. Jeevan, for the benefit of anybody who hasn't read it, he's a listener who in the beginning of the book, he appears in the first chapter, is a little bit lost in his life. He's been an entertainment photographer, a paparazzo, I suppose, for years. Hates his job. Has started training to be an EMT, ride in ambulances. And so the book opens at a moment when he's kind of figuring out what to do with his life. And I don't think it gives a huge amount away to say that after the collapse of civilization, he does manage to find some satisfaction in his work. But yeah, he was one of my favorite characters.
Me too. Well, actually, his brother was even, although, again, only tangentially in the book, his brother was one of my favorites, too, because he was so, hey, this is the way it is, this is the way the chips smell, right?
Yeah, his brother was very fatalistic and thoughtful.
Yeah. It's funny, if we circle back, which is like, you have one really good chapter where this guy Clark has this job where he's kind of like a life coach for businessmen trying to get them back on the right track. And they start using all those words that I hate, like circle back, the buzzwords.
Those words horrible.
I know, I got a whole list of them. Reaching out, and at this juncture instead of saying now.
Or at this time. Yeah,
at this time. But yeah, so I was going to use one because I wanted to circle back. Oh, and the funny thing is, after all this happens, the analogies make no sense anymore,
Right, exactly. What does it mean to pick low-hanging fruit? You haven't seen an orchard in 20 years.
Right.
Or, circling back. Circling back to what? It's interesting how abstract and silly, I think, those catchphrases would be in a different world.
What I was going to circle back to was Arthur, and at first I was kind of upset with him because, he got really famous and he made a lot of money and he had all these wives and he had what seemed to be a really good life that a lot of people would like, but he really was not happy with it at all, was he?
No, he wasn't. He was a chronically dissatisfied and restless person. Yeah, he's probably the most, I don't want to say the most, I was about to say he was the most overtly flawed character in the book, but there is the much more villainous character. He's a deeply flawed character. I found him kind of sympathetic. He's just kind of flailing around trying to figure it out. Thinks he'll be happy if he's successful, but then he's successful and he's still not happy. Thinks he'll be happy if he marries this new person, but he marries her and still not happy. And I think a lot of people live that way, which is really sad and unfortunate.
You delve into a lot of things like that, like Clark, when that one woman explains that he's just walking around not knowing how unhappy he is and going into the coffee room and hearing a joke, and all of a sudden he's happy for a moment and he carries that happiness with him for a few minutes and then it disappears. And there are a lot of people like that. It's a lot of insight for someone as young as you to realize that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you saying that. Yeah, I think it's really easy to almost go unconscious in your life. To find yourself in a position that I went into in the book a little bit, where you go to work and you have an enjoyable conversation in the break room, and the day passes quickly, and you're looking forward to the weekend, and then to your 2 or 3 weeks of paid vacation per year. And that's what happens to your life. And I don't know if we don't expect enough or what it is, but I do see that as a phenomenon around me.
Yeah, I know. It's like the level of happiness for a lot of people's lives is going to Disney World.
Yeah, exactly.
Or getting married at Disney World.
Right, which is heartbreaking.
It is.
Yeah, that probably made me sound like a snob. But yeah, it's almost as though we seek out distraction as a substitute for happiness. The way at the end of a long week you go to a loud bar and drink with your friends. And there's real happiness and companionship with your friends, but the loud music and the drinking and the distractedness of it.
Well, no, it's like sitting around
substitute.
playing golf, talking about mutual funds, wearing white shoes and a white belt, living in South. None of that really helps anything. But I'll tell you what's really funny.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's like people don't look up. So they don't see the stars, they don't see the moon, they just don't look up. And rather than going to a bar or whatever, if you look up, sometimes it's... And that happens in your book, too, because there's no light anymore, right? There's no artificial light. So explain that.
The loss of artificial light, that was one of the coolest things to think about when I was thinking about what this altered world would be. It's something that I alluded to in the book, which completely fascinates me. It's that in Galileo's time, one of the major scientific questions of the day was whether the Milky Way was made up of individual stars. It was just this wash of light overhead. And it's almost hard to imagine that now. There's so much light pollution all around us that, that is one thing that would be really beautiful about a world without electricity.
Yeah, they say, the Milky Way was called that because it was like someone just spilled this pitcher of milk across the sky.
Exactly, yeah.
And I actually interviewed a guy who wrote a book about darkness. He was actually obsessed a little bit too much with it, but it was like he looked for the darkest places on Earth. And what was interesting in that, and one scene you said was, it's not only that you can see the Milky Way great because there aren't any lights within a mile or two. What you were saying is you can see it great because there's no light anywhere.
Right, exactly.
And that takes it from 99% almost to 100%. Yeah, I thought that was, not only was that really well written, but it really gives you a good idea of what would happen. Because for today, today there will be 60 billion texts. And you talk about the day that the internet went down in your book. But I would even say it would be even more extreme than what you portrayed. If the internet went down and texting was impossible, I think people between the ages of 15 and 25 would almost go insane.
It's possible.
Like the girl who's looking around for a faxer in the airport.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. I don't want to paint everybody of that generation with the same brush, but it does seem as though sometimes we're losing the ability to talk to one another. We're so used to shooting off these emails. I just use that phrase, shooting off an email. Anyway, we're so
you did. That was what you was right on the page, and you you took that right off the page of your book.
I did. Yeah, and sending these texts. And what's lost are face-to-face conversations sometimes.
Yeah, it's it's being talked about a lot now, but people have lost the ability to recognize facial expressions. So when if I was sitting across from you, obviously we would know a little bit more about each other and how we felt about the book and things like that. And people have lost the ability because they're not really interested in having a one-on-one, face-to-face conversation. It's too troubling.
That's interesting. It is troubling. And of course you'd lose the ability if you didn't practice.
Yeah, just like...
Yeah, it's an interesting side effect of this technology.
Yeah, and that it's so funny because I know we end up talking about interesting things, but it has nothing to do with selling your book. So,
right.
So in the book, there's one character who's central to the book, and also there's a kind of spoiling thing about it too, which I won't talk about. But he's considered the prophet. Talk a little bit about him and how he affects the whole book. It's really funny because all these guys kind of affect the whole book, but the prophet especially. Right,
the prophet especially. The prophet is the person I've received the most criticism about of all the characters, which some of it's fair. The prophet is exactly the kind of person who you'd expect to emerge in a power vacuum, in a time when everybody's traumatized and a lot of people are looking for answers. He's a cult leader, essentially. He's somebody with an extremely warped vision of Christianity. It's no resemblance to the way, in my understanding, it's supposed to be practiced. And he emerges as a violent and charismatic leader with some pretty scary followers. And kind of, he makes his way through this new world until he finds a town that he can take over. He's the closest thing the book has to an absolute villain. But I have to say, and few people have disagreed with me about this. I find him ultimately sympathetic. You know, he was a kid on the road in the immediate aftermath of the complete collapse of civilization and would have seen and experienced some horrible things. So I imagined him as a traumatized figure more than an evil figure.
Boy, there's so many spoilers I'm thinking of that I could say right now. God.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Don't do it.
I think that's the mark of a good book, too.
Well, thanks.
Because, and actually one of the people in a certain situation, which might be towards the end of the aspect of talking about the prophet, is she feels that sympathy toward him, too. She doesn't feel...
She does.
Yeah, and that resonated with me. And also the fact he is who he is, and you know what I'm talking about, that also makes a big difference too, because once again, the book is woven very tightly, but you don't realize that until the very end of the book, right? It's like, it's really...
Right, yep.
So you planned that, I guess, but it seems hard to plan that ahead of time. I don't know.
I think that emerged in revisions.
Okay.
I don't think I knew the prophet's identity at the outset.
Really?
I probably didn't even have a prophet at the outset. No, it's funny. I never know how a book's going to end. I just start writing and see what happens. And of course, at a certain point, if you're 100 or 200 pages in, you have to start figuring some things out. But if the book's coherent at all, it's from the revision. I just went over and over and over this manuscript for probably a year and a half.
Wow.
Yeah, I did. The version of the book that I sent to my agent was labeled version 26, which those weren't 26 complete versions. I tend to rename the text file every time I make a major change in the book so that I can backtrack if necessary. But that gives some idea of what went into it. And then from there, once I gave it to my agent, and then once she sold it to these various publishers, there were 3 intense rounds of revisions with 3 different editors. So the book was really heavily worked over. And, a lot of those details, if not almost all of them, came about in revision.
That's funny, because once again, the book kind of mirroring your life and this work is like, if you deal with another central character who's Miranda, she is not satisfied with her work as she does it. And there's times when she revises and revises, doesn't she?
That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah, she's not...
Yeah, there's a particular... She writes, so for the benefit of her listeners, she writes and draws graphic novels. And, I remember the part you're talking about. There's one particular page that's important in the book where I think I mentioned that she redid it 15 times or something along those lines.
So maybe you were thinking subconsciously about your own revisions. Who knows?
It's entirely possible, now that you mention it.
That happens, I imagine. But
I think it does.
It's not a spoiler because the book is called Station 11. Do you want to talk a little bit about what Station 11 is, or do you want to just let it go, or what?
No, sure, I'll talk about that.
Okay.
Station 11 is the graphic novel that this character Miranda creates in the present day. And I think she was my favorite character if I had to pick one of all of them.
Yeah, me too.
She's a very intelligent person in a dead-end administrative job. And she derives a great deal of pleasure from this private art project of hers, drawing and writing these graphic novels. And one of the graphic novels is called Station 11. That's where the title of the book came from. And the reason for it, I suppose, was that if you're writing a book with a very nonlinear structure like this one, it jumps back and forth in time, there are multiple points of view, you really need things that will tie the whole mess together. And so I was thinking that the graphic novel would be a good way to tie together the pre- and post-apocalyptic sections of the book. It's another through line like Shakespeare that's kind of carried through both time periods.
It's funny, too, because you do something with Miranda that most people don't do in books, is Miranda, usually in a situation where a woman is scorned, she's then either out of the book or she has a downward spiral of some kind. But in Miranda's case, she goes, you know what? This is what's happened. I'm going to pull myself up by my own bootstraps, and I'm going to end up being just fine. And she does.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. She's a strong and practical person.
Yeah, almost.
The marriage falls apart, and she keeps going.
Yeah. She's very practical. Yeah. Maybe a little bit too practical. I don't know. I don't know whether she was a little bit too practical or not. But I was just
Right.
thinking about, if you think of books in terms of like of a ball of string, my brother and I talk about this a lot. I mean, there's lots of books where you can just unwind the string, you know? And there's the book.
Hmm.
And then there's other ones where the string is kind of tangled up. And the pleasure
Right.
is, oh man, or like fishing line. And the pleasure is taking the time to unwind it. And yeah, that's kind of what you were saying. It's a nonlinear book. It jumps around. People are, swung underneath and on top, and it's almost like that kind of feeling, isn't it?
It's true. Yeah, it is like that. Yeah, I enjoy reading both kinds of books. I really loved that book a few years ago on the Pulitzer, A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan.
Oh, I interviewed her right after she wrote that. She was a great.
Did you? Okay. Yeah, and that was a wonderful book. I love the
great.
way it's all kind of tangled, as you said, and figuring out characters' relationships is such a thrill and so interesting. And then some books that are absolutely non-linear, they're absolutely linear, are so satisfying too. That book, Stoner by John Williams, that everybody was reading about 2 years ago. It's just this kind of quiet masterpiece that marches slowly forward in time until the end, and it's perfect. Yeah, it's fun reading both.
Yeah. Have you read All the Light We Cannot See by any chance?
No, but I'm going to. I just did a festival with that author, and the book's being shipped back to Brooklyn as we speak. So.
Yeah, you'll love that book, and it's kind of a combination of the two. It's kind of linear in the sense of two linear stories that kind of somehow end up. You go, oh my God! When you're finished reading it, you go, oh, wait a minute, that happened.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I love that. Sometimes
looking forward to that one.
My brother gets mad, but I tell him. He always tells me that he kind of likes books where the ending is like a box with a top and has wrapping paper on it and a ribbon. And I don't like those at all. I like when you afterwards you have to think and say, wait a minute, did I get that right or not? But,
right. Although there's some happy medium. I mean, think of Lost. That was like all was in. But yeah, if you can hit somewhere in between, the perfectly wrapped up book with no loose ends and the end of Lost, then I feel like that's where you've nailed it.
There is something satisfying, like you said, about the linear method. I mean, I think it's easier on the reader in some senses, but I think it's much more satisfying to end. Well, let me ask you this then: when you finish your book or your books, do you kind of feel like, okay, that's it, he's done, it's my son, he's now going off to college, I'll send him away, and then it's up to him to make his way in the world. It's up to the reader to decide whether they like him or not, or do you hold on to it some way?
Experience has always been I want to let go much sooner than I can. Not for psychological reasons, but because the copy editor is coming back to you. These changes you keep having to make. Once I finish a book, I've been dealing with it for 2.5 or 3 years, and I would like nothing better than to just pass it off into the world. You keep on having to deal with it throughout the whole publication process, which takes a long time. I sold the book to publishers a year ago this month, and of course it just came out. And through that whole period, even when you're done with a major edit, then there's copy editor, then there's the proofreader, then there are queries from sales reps and various people through the industry all over the world. Well, on page 217, did you really mean X or should it be changed to Y? Those little things. But at this point, it's mostly out of my hands. We just made a couple of tiny changes for the paperback edition. But it's up to the book at this point. It'll sink or swim on the world by itself.
Although, maybe it's just me, but when you were saying I get the most criticism about the Prophet, it almost seemed like you were kind of attached to that. So. Well,
yeah, and it's an interesting thing. I've been criticized by more religious people about the Prophet, and their point, which isn't hugely unreasonable, is that the only overtly religious character in the book uses religion in the most negative way possible. And I would counter that by pointing out the character August, who's very important in the book. He's a very calm, honorable, low-key person. He doesn't live in an overtly religious way, but he does say a prayer over the dead whenever he comes across them, which is often, given the landscape. So I saw him as a kind of quietly spiritual person, which I intended as somewhat of a counterbalance to the extreme negative religiosity of the Prophet. But, that being said, I do see those critics' points. It's not hugely unreasonable.
Yeah. I'm always looking around for people, and the people I like to gravitate are Christians, but Christians with a small c. And when you deal with people who are used to thinking of Christianity with a big C, then the prophet is definitely not their guy. But the thing that's cool about August is, at first I'm thinking, does he do this every time? And then you realize that even though it's been so many years, he still has the Christian, if you want to put it, ability that when he sees this, like in that particular house that he visits, and when Kristen kind of steps away for a moment, he does what he always does, which he still has, whether it's not idealism, but he still has the feeling and the ability, even after all this time, to say those few words to them, you know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, he still sees their humanity. Yeah, he doesn't see these corpses as objects, which I think some more hardened people might at that point.
It's funny, I have a friend, and he has some animals, and actually, we both had alpacas, and there's this neurological disease along the Atlantic coast, kind of like your virus, and it kills them. And once you see their back legs just kind of wobble a little bit, it's too late. And
God!
So you try and you try, but you can't fix them. So sometimes to put them out of their misery, he would shoot them in the head. But before he did, he would always lay them down and he would talk to them, say, "Don't worry, everything's going to be okay now. It's going to be fine. You won't have to hurt anymore." And he would do that for like 5 minutes before he did it. And I always thought, what a nice thing to do, you know?
Yeah, that's really moving. That is a good thing to do.
So we were talking about how you wind things together. Did you like, well, we talked about revisions too, so I understand how it happened now, but there's so many characters. It's kind of like one of Stephen King's novels, like The Stand or something. Actually, The Stand is post-apocalyptic too. There were so many characters. Did you do some type of No, you didn't, because you didn't do an outline because it was coming to you as you were going along, right?
Right. I didn't do an outline, but there were a lot of moving parts in this book. So at a certain point, I found it necessary to put together a kind of map, which was an Excel spreadsheet that I had on my computer and kept updating, and then printed out and put on my wall, like taped above my desk, which had a list of chapters, a note on who had the point of view in each chapter, and where it was in time, pre or post-apocalyptic. And it was really useful, especially for the multiple point of view problem. I have, I think, 5 points of view in this book, maybe 4. And, if you see it laid out like that, as a kind of map, you can say, okay, well, if the reader doesn't see Jeevan between chapter 3 and page 250, they're going to forget who he is. So we have to reorder these chapters and put this in here or allude to him somehow in one of the future sections. So, yeah, the map was completely indispensable to figuring it all out and keeping it straight.
Yeah, actually, even that one scene, the first scene, Jeevan's running towards this incident, and then you see the incident from another person's point of view, and then you see it from the most intimate point of view.
That's true. Yeah. That's something that I've been interested in for a while, and part of why I like doing this structure with the multiple points of view. I did it probably the most explicitly in my last book, the Lola Quartet, which is I had the same scene. I think we came back to it 4 times from different perspectives. I'm really interested in memory and the way different people will remember the same event in completely different ways. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's funny.
So,
It's almost like you storyboarded it, which goes back to the fact that it's kind of a cinematic book, which means maybe it'll be a movie. Who knows?
Maybe, yeah. I just sold the option. So
you did?
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Yeah, because, again, it's... It wouldn't be marketed necessarily as a post-apocalyptic, and I have characters in my head too. I kind of feel like I know. Well, I was saying, no, I'm not going to say who they would be, but do you have people in your own mind as to who might play who?
Yeah, casting ideas occurred to me.
It's so funny doing that.
Yeah.
But it's funny, when you're talking about different points of view, I was thinking of Quentin Tarantino, because when he has a point of view, like, say, in Pulp Fiction, that he doesn't think he can get in somehow in the story, he just puts another scene in where something completely different happens, and you got to suspend your disbelief again because like when
Right.
John Travolta dies, he doesn't die. He's at the end of the book, but in at the end of the movie, but he dies in the movie too.
Yeah, that's true.
Or like in Kill
Yeah,
Bill.
it's a really interesting effect.
Yeah, it's daring. It's a very daring thing to do and could fail miserably, but he's a big risk taker and doesn't really care, I guess.
Which is what makes it so exciting. I mean, would Pulp Fiction still have been a great movie if it were told in a completely linear way? And maybe it would have been, but it would have been so different and kind of ordinary. You know, if we just got this linear march through time until the ending.
Yeah, and it's kind of like your book too. It's like if you look back on Pulp Fiction now, it's like, oh well, it wasn't that innovative. But of course, that's because everything afterwards has copied it. So
Yeah, exactly.
right. So at the moment it was made, it was holy mackerel. I mean, this is amazing.
Yeah.
But then so many people.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. It's
Yeah,
like
everybody was talking about that structure.
yeah, it's like the spinning and slow motion scenes in like The Matrix, you know.
Right, which look hilariously dated now, but only because we saw them in the Matrix.
Yeah, I know. And when you saw them, you were just floored, right? It was just amazing.
Yeah, exactly. It was like magic.
So before we close, one of the things I want to talk about is, and this was like this. Actually, this is kind of a good segue, because the airport, which becomes very important in terms of grounding, no pun intended, grounding the book. The airport scene is really cool because you don't usually think of planes as doing what those planes did, the way they landed, and
Right.
or an airport becoming a home.
Yeah, it's interesting, and if you travel a lot, it's slightly horrifying to think about. But I based that a little bit off a story I heard from a friend of mine who her plane left New York en route to London, I believe, on September 11th, 2001. And an hour into the air, the attacks happened, and flights over North America were grounded. So her plane was diverted into Halifax, and she ended up spending the night in the airport. And she talked about how surreal it was seeing that line of jets outside from all over the world. You know, flights that wouldn't normally have landed here. So South China Air, Air Canada, Air France, all of these foreign carriers. And so I think I've been thinking of that a little bit as I was writing the book. And I guess I was spending a lot of time in airports as I was working on it. I was on tour for my previous book, the Lola Quartet. And it's kind of interesting when you're stranded in the airport to think, now what if this didn't end? Like, how long could you live here? And it was interesting also to think of an airport in non-transitory terms. You know, it's a place that you pass through. But what if it isn't? What would it mean to live there? It was interesting writing those things.
Yeah, it's funny. They said that during 9/11 and the week following it, when everything was grounded, that Earth orbit satellites, low Earth orbit satellites, were able to get the clearest pictures they'd ever gotten of the planet Earth because there wasn't any contrails of any kind. So it was like,
that's interesting.
Yeah, you know,
Right.
and it's like in your book, people thinking about, or the little girl saying, you know, how could something this big? How did it just jump into the air? And he has to explain.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing to think of how abstract things like flight would seem to somebody who'd never seen it.
It's just like every time I get on an airplane and it flies, I can't believe that it does.
Same here. When it takes off, it's kind of breathtaking.
I know. And then you're up in the air and you realize you're reading a book or whatever, and you look down and you realize, you know, like you were, 30,000 feet. You say it in the book. But
Yeah, exactly.
and the other interesting thing about the airport, and you can talk about it a little bit if you want to, is there's this one Air Gradia jet that parks in a different place for a specific reason, but you don't have to talk about it if you don't want to.
Right. Yeah, that's probably the most horrific thing in the book. But
Yes.
I kept it off stage. I didn't want to really go inside that plane.
I know. Neither did I.
Yeah. The situation there is quarantine. You know, it's like they would have realized in the air that some other passengers were sick and understood what was happening. And when they landed the plane, opted to take it to the farthest corner of the airport and not let any passengers off.
Which was an incredible act of bravery and self-sacrifice.
Yeah, it would be self-sacrifice.
I don't know if it would really happen, though. I don't know.
I don't either. No, I mean, you'd like to think that it might. I'm kind of doubtful personally, but yeah.
But but it happened. I like that. You know, it's like, okay, we both doubt that it would happen, but you know, it did happen.
Yeah.
So
actually, if I remember correctly, I think there were plague villages in England that isolated themselves by choice.
yeah, there were. You're right. In
Yeah.
fact, what was that book by Connie Willis about it? Year of Wonder or
Right.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know, it's like you're close. All of a sudden, whatever you write becomes closer to reality. Like today, the Center for Disease Control said that, you know, there 1.4 million people are going to die of the Ebola virus.
Oh, God.
I know. It's and
Yeah.
then you think about it. You think about, okay, well, if it's airborne, and then, well, that's the other thing about today's world, and what happens in your book too is once someone gets on an airplane somewhere, and you even say it, I think that way, they all become patient zero.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's a pretty serious contrast with, say, the plague. You know, where it took the plague years to get to England.
Right.
Now it would happen in the length of an airplane flight. You know, it's kind of incredible.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah,
the things that make our world extraordinary make us vulnerable. It's the lesson.
Okay, so last thing. The other guy,
Okay.
again, the other character I really liked, but was in there for maybe a page, was the doctor at the emergency room calling up Jivan and saying, hey, take off, get out of here. Because he already knows he's paranoid anyway.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I liked him. Yeah, he actually a sort of advanced warning system for Jivan, one of the major characters in the book. And it's sheer luck for Jivan that he has a friend who happens to work in the hospital and sees what's going on before the news is made public and starts calling around.
Plus, it's always amazing to me how doctors who know they're treating something that's fatal and that's contagious actually they're treating it knowing it's
That's
contagious. It's always been an amazing thing.
Yeah, I think about the heroism of the doctors treating Ebola these days.
Yeah, I know.
It's so dangerous, but they're right there anyway.
I know.
It's so admirable to me.
Yes, very much so. Well, so anyway, I really enjoyed the book. I really enjoyed talking to you today about it. And then when it comes out in paperback or when your next book comes out, come and visit us if you ever get a chance in Philadelphia. We'd love to see you and have you sign at our bookstore.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. So we're talking to Emily St. John Mandel regarding her latest book, which is Station 11, where you pretty much talked it out. And it's a really good book. Don't shy away from it because you think it's post-apocalyptic or science fiction or something like that, because it's not. It's just a really good book that makes you think and has lots of characters that you're drawn to right away because they're fully formed almost in a page or so. She has this uncanny ability to create a person who's real standing before you after a page of exposition and description. So anyway, you know, I've been really lucky these past few weeks getting these great authors, which brings me to next week. Now, we've gotten popular enough, and like with this award, which floors me for being the best Philadelphia bookstore, we've gotten popular enough that the publicists now are contacting us instead of us contacting them. So we have a lot to choose from. It's a wealth of authors who are really good and have great books. So next week we're still deciding. I know I say that every once in a while, but now it's maybe becoming more and more often. But so next week we're still deciding. So we have a bunch we're looking at. But trust me, it'll definitely be a good book and a good author because there are so many out there. And it's kind of frustrating because it's impossible, literally impossible for me to keep up with everything. But anyway, join us next week for whomever it is we pick. And thanks, as always, for being loyal to our show and, as importantly, to the bookstore.
You've been listening to the Avid Reader Show with your host, Sam Hankin. Sam will be back next week with reviews and interviews of some of the more interesting books and authors of today.